Il n'a pas rencontré la personne qu'il lui fallait.
Qu'est-ce que vous en savez?
Je les observe parfois de ma fenêtre.
The Three Colors Trilogy is a set of 3 acclaimed films directed by Polish filmmaker Krzysztof Kieślowski in the early 1990s. Its trilogy consists of Blue, White, and Red, released at different times. It's not a series, each story has its meaning, however they're interlinked at certain points. The films are not only entertaining but also rich in historical lessons that viewers continue to discuss, even decades after their release. Let's uncover what made this trilogy so special in these 20 weird facts. Number 20. The trilogy was inspired by the French flag. Krzysztof Kieślowski's Three Colors trilogy is often introduced as a meditation on the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that inspired the French Revolution. The 3 films, Blue, White, and Red, were released in 1993 and 1994 respectively. They reflect the colors of the French flag as well as its symbol. However, it is not entirely about France. At first glance, it may appear deeply tied to French cultural identity. Film critics, scholars, and audiences alike were quick to interpret the trilogy as an exploration of French history, reframed in a late 20th century context. However, in interviews, Kieślowski repeatedly denied this interpretation. He swore that while the colors and their symbolic connections may be pointing at France, the films themselves were not truly about France or its revolutionary heritage. Another thing that cannot be ignored is the fact that each film not only corresponds to a color, but also subtly plays with the theme associated with that color. Blue, set in Paris, explores liberty through the grief and isolation of Juliette Binoche's character, Julie. White follows Karol, a Polish immigrant, as he navigates the imbalance of equality in his marriage and status. Red, perhaps the most celebrated of the 3, explores fraternity through the unlikely bond between a young model and a retired judge in Geneva. The similarities between liberty, equality, and fraternity are only carefully woven into the narratives. Kieślowski chose France as his backdrop precisely because it gave him freedom to tell stories he couldn't have said in Poland. French producers, funding, and actors gave him access to European audiences. France was the symbolic stage where his universal themes could resonate. Hence, the trilogy becomes both about France and not about France. It uses the flag as a visual and thematic hook, but ultimately transcends it, pointing toward the shared human struggles that surpass national boundaries. Number 19. Blue's entire mood was designed to feel cold. From the very first frames of Three Colors, Blue, in 1993, viewers are pulled into an atmosphere that feels chilling and heavy with sorrow. This wasn't accidental. Krzysztof Kieślowski and his cinematographer, Sławomir Idziak, meticulously designed the film's mood to feel visually, emotionally, and even symbolically cold. Blue, after all, was not only the color of the French flag's first stripe, but also the color of mourning and anything that has to do with sorrow. To achieve this effect, the crew altered the very mechanics of the filming process by fitting lighting rigs with blue gels, creating scenes that have an icy tone, thereby not letting the audience escape Julie's grief. The use of blue gels created an almost artificial atmosphere. Light that would normally soften a room or highlight warmth instead flattened it with a ghostly tint. This technique underscored the idea that Julie's world was shattered, and her perception was filtered through an unrelenting sorrow that she couldn't turn off. The obsession with blue went beyond lighting. Objects in Julie's orbit were deliberately chosen or altered to reinforce the color palette. Her late husband's unfinished symphony is associated with a sheet of blue music paper. Her swimming pool, where she retreats to escape the world, glows with a hypnotic blue. Even fragments of stained glass from the car shimmer in shades of blue. Ironically, the film's coldness produces its deepest warmth. The contrast makes those glimpses of hope profoundly moving. Without the overwhelming coldness of blue, the eventual release of emotion would have resonated as powerfully as it does. Number 18. Juliette Binoche, refused body doubles. In Blue's nude scenes, Juliette Binoche's performance in Blue is often hailed as one of the most emotionally raw portrayals of grief in modern cinema. One of the lesser-known facts about her commitment to the role was her refusal to use body doubles in the film's nude scenes. Binoche felt that nudity in Blue wasn't about sensuality or physical exposure, but about vulnerability in the face of unimaginable loss. She felt that for Julie's grief to be communicated fully, she needed to feel the pain by herself, not anybody else. If Julie was to feel naked, exposed, and stripped of all illusions, then Binoche herself had to embody that truth. She only saw the nude as an extension of the character's internal journey, not any sort of physical challenge. Hence, she embraced it. Throughout her career, she has embraced roles that require emotional and physical risk. She is known for her refusal to compromise when it comes to authenticity. Kieślowski, for his part, supported Binoche's insistence. He was a director who valued psychological realism above everything else, and he trusted Binoche to handle the delicate balance of vulnerability and strength. Number 17. The sugar cube dissolving. In Blue took 15 takes. Among the many striking images in Blue is the close-up of a sugar cube slowly absorbing coffee in Juliette Binoche's hand. This could be seen as just an ordinary act, but Kieślowski never saw it that way. That single moment that lasted for just a few seconds on screen reportedly took 15 takes to capture because the director was obsessed with finding the perfect speed of melting. The scene comes at a crucial point in Julie's journey. Having cut herself off from the world after her husband and daughter's deaths, she begins to experience life afresh. The sugar cube dissolving into the dark liquid became a representation of transformation and the passage of time. Kieślowski wanted the process to feel almost hypnotic, as though the world itself was slowing down to let grief, memory, and healing seep in at their own rhythm. However, achieving this simple task on camera proved surprisingly difficult. The speed at which sugar dissolves was not compliant with what Kieślowski needed. If the sugar melted too quickly, the shot lost its contemplative weight. If it melted too slowly, it dragged without purpose. So Kieślowski kept demanding retakes until the cube dissolved at precisely the rhythm he had in his mind. Cinematographer Sławomir Idziak later remarked that this kind of obsessiveness was typical of Kieślowski. He had an uncanny ability to turn ordinary objects into profound visual symbols, but doing so required extraordinary patience. Juliette Binoche herself spoke about the surreal intensity of filming such shots. In the end, the 15 takes were not wasted. Number 16. In White, the suitcase scene was rehearsed over 40 times before filming. In 3 colors. White, one of the strangest, most darkly comic moments, is the sight of Carol emerging from a suitcase. What many don't know about the hilarious scene is how much work went into making that single moment feel believable. Before the cameras even rolled, Kieślowski had Zamachowski, who played Carol, rehearse the act of folding himself into and crawling out of the suitcase more than 40 times. At this point in the film, Carol had been humiliated and stripped of dignity by his divorce from Dominique, played by Julie Delpy. Reduced to poverty and desperation, he sneaks back to Poland inside a suitcase. This reflects his crumpled, overlooked, and discarded position in the world, which feels like baggage. Despite this sorrowful symbol, the director decided to add a little humor to it. This he did as a reminder that equality, which was the central theme of White, often arrives in strange and ironic ways. The rehearsals were grueling. Zamachowski had to learn how to contort his body into the confined space in a way that looked natural, but didn't injure him. The suitcase had to be handled by other actors, carried, dragged, and dropped, without breaking the illusion that Carol could realistically survive inside it. Crew members later recalled how strangely intense the process became. Watching an actor fold himself into a suitcase over and over might sound absurd, but it perfectly reflected Kieślowski's working style. Zamachowski himself admitted that the scene was exhausting, both physically and psychologically. In the end, Kieślowski was able to prove that equality doesn't always appear as a noble principle. Number 15. Kieślowski shot White's Paris exteriors, guerrilla style, often without permits. Unlike Blue and Red, which carry a smoother, almost dreamlike polish, White is the opposite. It was rough, restless, and unpredictable. That tone is also reflected in the very way the film was shot. Kieślowski decided to film many of the Paris exteriors guerrilla style, often without obtaining official permits. This means that instead of locking down streets and hiring extras, he placed his actors directly into the chaos of real Paris. He allowed them to be swallowed by crowds of unsuspecting bystanders. This is because shooting in Paris with full permits would have been expensive, time-consuming, and restrictive. However, it was also an artistic choice. Kieślowski wanted Karol's alienation to feel real, and the best way to achieve this is to throw him into real-life crowds where nobody cared who he was. The result is a striking contrast with the controlled aesthetic of Blue. This approach came with so many risks. Without permits, the crew had to work quickly, often setting up shots in minutes before security or police intervened. He would at times be forced to improvise entirely, capturing fleeting moments before being asked to move on. The actors, especially Zbigniew Zamachowski, had to adjust their performances to unpredictable circumstances. He had to stay in character even when random pedestrians brushed past him, stared, or ignored him entirely. That unpredictability was a test of his acting skills because he wasn't just playing an outsider in Paris, but was actually one. Number 14. The trilogy was originally meant to include a fourth film. What many viewers don't know is that Three Colors was, at one point, not supposed to end with red. During the early planning stages, Krzysztof Kieślowski and his collaborators considered extending the project into a four-part cycle. The idea was that a fourth film would complete the structure, maybe exploring another theme or providing a further resolution to the interconnected lives glimpsed in the trilogy's finale. However, that idea was abandoned. This is because some people already expected that the Three Colors project would follow this pattern of expansion, just as Kieślowski's other movies. Thus, Kieślowski resisted this temptation. He quickly realized that the trilogy wasn't just about numbers or symmetry and decided to choose the path of honesty. If he had chosen dishonesty, then it could only mean that he was only interested in creating art that is decorative or redundant. If he had to be honest with his art, then he would have to know when to stop. That restraint gave the trilogy its unusual power. It feels both complete, ending with a finale that gathers the surviving characters from all three films into one climactic shipwreck scene. There has been endless speculation about what the fourth film might have been. Some critics have suggested it could have dealt with justice or perhaps explored a different national context beyond France. Nonetheless, all such theories remain speculative. Kieślowski himself dismissed them, making clear that the trilogy was never meant to expand beyond its three colors. In a way, the absence of a fourth film is a final reminder that not everything can be completed. Number 13. Red was secretly filmed in Geneva. Officially, Red was framed as part of the French-backed trilogy, but Kieślowski quietly moved much of the production into Geneva, Switzerland. The director described Switzerland as a country detached from the political extremes of its neighbors, sitting apart like an observer of history. That neutrality was the perfect metaphorical backdrop for the film. Red is often regarded as the trilogy's most philosophical installment, and its use of Geneva heightens this quality. The city's clean surfaces and controlled calmness were an opposite reflection of Valentine and the retired judge. Their lives intersect in ways that suggest predestination, yet the setting itself appears untouched by the characters' passions and struggles. Filming in Switzerland also allowed Kieślowski to underline the trilogy's pan-European ambition. Blue was set in France, White moved between Paris and Poland, and Red landed in Geneva, the symbolic seat of international diplomacy. By ending the trilogy in Switzerland, Kieślowski placed the conclusion in a country historically known for standing outside the conflicts that had scarred Europe. Geneva's architecture and geography became central to the film's visual identity. Another advantage was that Geneva's neutrality offered a certain freedom of production, away from the bureaucratic complications of filming in more politically charged environments. The crew moved with discretion, blending seamlessly into a city that seemed to ignore them. Number 12. Jean-Louis Trintignant, initially turned down Red. When Krzysztof Kieślowski began casting Red in 1994, he knew the retired judge at the film's center required a performer of extraordinary depth. So he envisioned Jean-Louis Trintignant, one of France's most respected actors, for the role. However, things did not turn out as he had initially envisioned. Trintignant had already decided he was finished with the cinema. By the early 1990s, Trintignant was tired and disillusioned with the industry. He had grown weary of the grind of filmmaking, and in interviews, he hinted that he no longer felt the urge to perform. He had retreated into a quieter life, preferring personal pursuits over the camera. So when Kieślowski asked him to star in Red, he declined immediately. He told the director plainly that he had quit acting and wasn't interested in returning for another film. But Kieślowski refused to accept the refusal. He insisted that the role was written with him in mind. According to crew members, Kieślowski practically begged, telling the actor that only he could embody the moral weight and inner contradictions of the retired judge. Moved by Kieślowski's sincerity and by the material itself, Trintignant eventually relented. The result was one of Trintignant's most haunting performances. Critics widely praised his performance, noting how his restrained presence contrasted with Irene Jacobs' youthful openness. It's striking to think that if Kieślowski had not insisted, Red might have been made without Trintignant. Number 11. The judge in Red was inspired by a real eavesdropping judge. The enigmatic judge in Red, played by Jean-Louis Trintignant, is one of the most memorable characters in the Three Colors trilogy. He was a man who sat alone in his house, secretly tapping his neighbors' phone calls, detached from life yet strangely entangled in it. Many assume such a character was born purely from the writer's imagination, but in truth, his inspiration came from a startling real-world encounter. During the early 1990s, while preparing the script for the trilogy with his collaborator Krzysztof, Kieślowski heard of a real judge who was notorious for eavesdropping on his neighbors. What struck Kieślowski more was the fact that a judge who is entrusted with impartiality, fairness, and the highest standards of privacy could indulge in such private curiosity. This knowledge was gold for Kieślowski. A judge who spies on others embodied the themes he wanted to explore in Red. The character was quickly written not as a villain, but as a deeply human one who is disillusioned, lonely, and guilty, yet still capable of connection. When Trintignant finally embodied the role, his performance made the judge more than a symbol. Without Kieślowski's encounter with that real-life eavesdropping judge, the trilogy's closing act might have lacked its haunting central figure. Number 10. All three films feature the exact same old woman recycling a bottle. One of the most curious details in the Three Colors trilogy is the recurring appearance of an elderly woman struggling to place a glass bottle in a recycling bin. The scene appears in blue, white, and red, but it was fleeting and easily overlooked. Kieślowski deliberately placed that woman as a thread linking the films. In blue, Julie notices the old woman but does not offer her assistance. She watches briefly and walks away, absorbed in her grief. In white, Carol is too consumed by his own humiliation and doesn't notice the woman at all. Then, in red, Valentine stops and helps the old lady, gently lifting the bottle into the slot. This small act of kindness resonates profoundly with the trilogy's core ideas. Kieślowski later explained that the old woman with her aged, fragile features represented Europe itself, struggling with burdens too heavy for her to lift alone. As in the early 1990s, Europe was undergoing seismic changes, which included the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the reunification of Germany, and the growing integration of the European Union. Old conflicts lingered beneath the surface, while new alliances were being forged. The old woman's battle with the recycling bin became a symbol of these shared struggles. On another level, the sequence is about fraternity, the last of the trilogy's ideals. Fraternity is not grand political slogans, but small acts of compassion, the decision to help when help is needed. Julie's indifference in blue and Carol's distraction in white reveal fractured relationships with fraternity, while Valentine's gesture in red provides a moment of redemption. By connecting the three films through this image, Kieślowski quietly suggested that human connection is measured not by ideology, but by the simplest gestures of care. Number 9. Kieślowski, originally wanted. Irene Jacob to play in all three films. When Krzysztof Kieślowski began shaping the Three Colors trilogy, he briefly toyed with the idea of casting Irene Jacob in all three films. Irene was not only one of his favorite collaborators, but also a kind of muse. Her blend of innocence, mystery, and emotional transparency perfectly embodied the qualities he sought in his heroines. He thought Irene's presence in the three trilogies would unify them. She'll be the face through which liberty, equality, and fraternity were seen. However, Kieślowski ultimately abandoned the plan. He feared that if Irene appeared in blue, white, and red, audiences would begin to distrust the experiment. This is because the trilogy was already ambitious, with each film designed around a color, an abstract ideal, and its own distinct mood. To ask viewers to accept the same actress in three different unrelated roles risked breaking their delicate beliefs. Rather than immersing themselves in the moral puzzles of each film, audiences might instead be distracted, wondering why the same person kept reappearing in new contexts. Despite his restraint, Kieślowski could not resist placing Irene at the trilogy's heart. He cast her in red as Valentine, the compassionate model who befriends the reclusive judge. Valentine becomes the trilogy's moral compass, the character who embodies fraternity through small gestures of kindness. Had Irene played all three leads, the trilogy might have resembled a more experimental art project, with one actress serving as a prism for three ideals. Number 8. Zbigniew Preisner created a fictional Dutch composer. One of the strangest running motifs in Krzysztof Kieślowski's films is the presence of a composer who never existed. This fictional 18th-century Dutch master was the invention of Zbigniew Preisner, the Polish composer who scored nearly all of Kieślowski's major works, including the Three Colors trilogy. Rather than attributing certain pieces directly to himself, Preisner often credited them to this imaginary figure. The idea of a fake composer named Van den Boedenmeijer began years earlier, during Decalogue and the double life of Veronique. Preisner, working closely with Kieślowski in this movie, came up with a backstory for him. It was the story of a composer who lived in the late 70s, wrote in a vaguely romantic style, and whose works were supposedly rediscovered centuries later. From this idea, Kieślowski and Preisner began planting Boedenmeyer's music in films. The audience hears a melody and believes it belongs to some long-dead master, when in fact, it was newly written for the screen. In the Three Colors trilogy, Boedenmeijer made recurring appearances. In blue, Julie struggled with fragments of an unfinished orchestral work said to be written by her late husband. The solemn, haunting composition is attributed to Boedenmeijer within the story. In red, Boedenmeyer's music surfaces again, this time as a subtle echo, reinforcing the idea that art can travel across boundaries. Now you may wonder why they have to go through the trouble of inventing a fake composer. This is your answer. Kieślowski and Preisner were only playing a game, and at the same time, imparting philosophy. They believed that attaching a false history to the music made it feel richer, as if it had already lived in the world before entering the film. It also reflected Kieślowski's fascination with hidden connections and the ambiguity of truth. Just as his films blur the line between chance and destiny, Boedenmeijer blurred the line between reality and fiction. Number 7. In white, some courtroom extras were real lawyers. One of the things that made White unique was the depiction of legal systems, corruption, and justice. Much of the film revolves around trials, divorces, and shady deals, so it's no surprise that Kieślowski wanted his courtroom scenes to feel authentic. Rather than relying solely on professional actors, he went a step further by recruiting real lawyers as background extras for some of the legal proceedings. Their presence added a layer of realism that no amount of acting classes could fully capture. Audiences who are not familiar with courtrooms might not have noticed this. However, those who have spent time in such an environment will definitely do so. This casting choice also reflects Kieślowski's documentary roots. Before turning to feature films, he had made numerous documentaries in Poland, and that instinct for realism never left him. Even in a dark comedy like White, which was about a man shipped across borders in a suitcase, he wanted the institutional settings to carry the gravity of real life. By blending trained actors like Zbigniew Zamachowski with real professionals, he created a world that felt both truthful and surreal. Interestingly, This blending of reality and fiction echoes the trilogy's larger themes. In White, equality is mocked. The divorce trial in Paris humiliates Carol, the Polish protagonist, exposing the power imbalance between him and his French wife. The lawyers involved in this definitely had a peculiar experience. Instead of practicing their craft in real life, they were reenacting its gestures for a camera. In doing so, they became part of Kieślowski's broader meditation on justice, fairness, and absurdity. Number 6. Kieślowski hated interviews. Krzysztof Kieślowski was famously evasive when it came to explaining his films. By the time he released the Three Colors trilogy in the early 1990s, critics and academics were clamoring to decode every symbol. They were asking, was blue truly about liberty, white about equality, red about fraternity, or were these ideals just convenient labels for deeper, more personal stories? When confronted with such questions, Kieślowski almost always shrugged them off. He had always been wary of over-interpretation. Coming from a background in documentary filmmaking, Kieślowski believed cinema should speak directly to the viewer's emotions, not be dissected like a textbook. However, critics adored knowing the deeper meaning of every context in his work. Rather than indulge them, he often responded with contradictions. In one interview, he might claim that the trilogy was inspired directly by the ideals of the French Revolution. In another, he would insist it had nothing to do with politics or France at all, and that the flag's colors were just a pretext for exploring human emotions. Sometimes he would say blue was about freedom from grief, other times that it was about bondage to the past. These contradictions were deliberate. It was his own way of resisting the trap that turned art into analysis. Friends and collaborators confirmed that Kieślowski disliked interviews in general. He felt that they always try to coerce him into saying what will pin down intentionally ambiguous meanings. If he tries to explain, he feels it would be dishonest. So instead, he preferred to answer slyly, offering critics conflicting statements. In doing so, he protected the films from being reduced to a single interpretation. Number 5. Red's dog was so badly behaved. (128:48 to 128:56). One of the unexpected hurdles during the making of Red was the dog. The dog in question belonged to Valentine, the central character of the film, who discovers the animal injured on the street and brings it into her life. Behind the camera, the four-legged actor turned into one of the production's biggest headaches. The animal seemingly suffered mood swings. The director wanted the dog to project a certain sadness, a kind of heaviness that would mirror the film's meditations on fate and compassion. However, dogs don't understand existential burdens, nor do they conveniently perform sorrow on cue. The animal trainer tried endlessly to coax the dog into appearing downcast or mournful, but the results were wildly inconsistent. Sometimes the dog would wag its tail happily, other times it would jump at irate Jacob with too much enthusiasm, completely shattering the intended tone of a scene. Entire shooting days reportedly dissolved into waiting around for the dog to look convincingly sorrowful. Cast and crew would sit by, watching as assistant directors whispered to the animal, trying to dim its energy, while Irene tried to improvise ways to keep her patience in character. The delays became such a running joke on set that some of the crew referred to the dog as the true diva of Red. Unlike human actors, who could adjust under Kieślowski's direction, the animal would only perform on its own terms. The dog's uncooperative nature gave it a raw, untrained presence that fit perfectly into the film's themes of unpredictability and fate. What later emerges on the screen is a dog that feels heartbreakingly real. Number 4. The trilogy ends with all surviving main characters appearing in Red's Ferry.
Récupérer 7 personnes qui sont saines et sauves.
Disaster 017 to 025. One of the most brilliant touches in the Three Colors trilogy comes at its very end. In Red, the final film, there is a catastrophic ferry accident in the English Channel. As television news reports the survivors, audiences suddenly realize that the 7 people who lived are none other than the central characters from all 3 films. Julie from Blue, Carol and Dominique from white, Valentine and the retired judge from red all appear among the saved. This is not a coincidence but a revelation that quietly binds the trilogy together, showing that these seemingly separate stories were always connected. The sequence functions as a narrative knot, pulling the three films into a single thread at the last possible moment. Kieślowski was meticulous about this ending. He wanted it to be both shocking and understated. There's also a deep irony here. The trilogy was supposedly inspired by the French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but Kieślowski often portrayed them in bitterly subverted forms. In the final moment, however, fraternity emerges in its most profound sense. These characters, from diverse nations and facing different struggles, come together. Viewers have said that the ending feels almost mystical, as if fate had been guiding these stories all along. Others interpreted it as a commentary on Europe itself. What makes this final link so effective is the way Kieślowski subtly underlines the connections with a brief television broadcast. That indeed carries the weight of three films. In one stroke, he reminded viewers that while individuals pursue private struggles, they are all part of a larger, interconnected human story. This ending is part of why Red and the trilogy as a whole continue to resonate decades later. It's not just three films about three ideals, but a story about how our lives, whether we realize it or not, constantly overlap. Number 3. The ferry rescue scene used real water tanks and almost drowned extras. While the final ferry disaster in Red looks brief and almost just a television news clip summarizing the tragedy, the shooting was far more intense, chaotic, and even dangerous. Instead of relying solely on stock footage or miniatures, the production built large water tank setups to simulate the aftermath of the accident. Extras were thrown into these tanks to portray exhausted survivors clinging to wreckage or being pulled into lifeboats. This was dangerous as the setup was rough. Safety standards for film productions in the early 1990s were not always as strictly enforced as they are today, and accounts from the set suggest that the crew pushed the limits to get realism. The water tanks were filled to near capacity, the lighting rigs made the environment hot, and currents created by wave machines left some extras genuinely struggling to stay afloat. A few background performers reportedly panicked, swallowed water, and had to be pulled out by crew members acting as impromptu lifeguards. At least one extra was said to have passed out from exhaustion, leading to an emergency pause in filming. Kieślowski's quest for realism came at a cost. Extras had to endure long hours in frigid water and difficult conditions that would definitely not be tolerated in today's world of filmmaking. Much of the footage from the tank was later trimmed down and only appears in the background of a newscast within the film. These near accidents on set also underscore the strange tension between cinema and reality. In their pursuit of truth, the filmmakers recreated conditions that pushed real people to genuine distress. Number 2. Red was nominated for 3 Oscars. When Red premiered in 1994, it was immediately hailed as a masterpiece. By early 1995, the film had crossed into the rare territory where European art cinema found recognition in Hollywood. At the Academy Awards, Red received 3 nominations for Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Cinematography. For a foreign-language film, this was an extraordinary achievement. However, before the Oscars even took place, Kieślowski publicly announced his retirement from filmmaking. The declaration shocked both fans and industry insiders. Here was a director at the height of his powers. His trilogy was revered, his international reputation was secure, and his influence was rapidly growing. Still, amidst all these, he walked away. When pressed for reasons, he said he was tired, disillusioned with the demands of filmmaking, and uninterested in repeating himself. The Oscars themselves passed without a win for Red. Many considered it a snub, especially for the Best Director category, where Kieślowski lost to Robert Zemeckis for Forrest Gump. However, in a way, Kieślowski's retirement announcement overshadowed the outcome. By refusing to chase awards or cling to the industry, he framed himself as an artist who valued integrity over recognition. Number 1. Kieślowski died. Just 2 years later, making Red his farewell to cinema. After announcing his retirement from directing in 1994, at the height of acclaim for the Three Colors trilogy, many assumed Kieślowski would eventually return. However, the decision proved final, even though it happened in a way nobody expected. In 1996, only 2 years after Red's release, Kieślowski passed away unexpectedly following complications from heart surgery. He was just 54 years old. The news shocked the international film community. The tragedy lent Red an aura of finality. His passing deepened the trilogy's legacy. Critics revisited Blue, White, and Red as an artist's final testament. Viewers began to see Red in particular as a summation of Kieślowski's worldview about compassion. Red was his way of saying farewell to cinema. What have you learned from these weird facts about the Three Colors trilogy? Which of these facts do you find more interesting? Share with us in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, explore the other videos on your screen.